Today we're going to be joined with Dan Murphy. Dan's going to be joining us here in just a few seconds. You can see Dan there popping on. Hey, Dan. Um, but we are going to be talking about water rights today, and I feel very, very privileged to be able to talk with Dan about this today. Um, he is, in my opinion, one of the top experts when it comes to water rights and its application to real estate throughout the state of Colorado, but much of the Western United States as well. So you are all in for a treat. If you've never attended one of our webinars before, this is a very open forum type webinar. We put these on to try to get as much information out there to landowners, real estate agents, land professionals as possible. So at any time during the webinar, if you have a question, please feel free to email that in to Michaela Bishop. That is at mb@landgate.com. Email those in. We're going to do our best to try to get those answered live on the webinar. This is being recorded, so there's everyone that has registered for this webinar will receive a copy of this recording, and you'll be able to watch it whenever you wish. But again, we do encourage as much participation in these webinars as possible. We usually get a lot of really, really good questions and some additional topics to discuss real time with the professionals that we have on. If you've seen some of our previous webinars, you see that we have people come in and talk about solar energy or oil and gas minerals or whatever the topic is for that week. And as I said, all of you signed up because you're all interested in water rights. And again, very, very excited to have Dan Murphy on. I'll give a quick introduction here of Dan. If you're in the real estate world and the brokerage world in Colorado or the western part of the United States, you have heard of Dan Murphy and M4 Ranches. These guys churn out amazing properties, and they do, in my opinion, some of the best marketing of some of these large mountain ranches and farms that I've ever seen. I mean, these guys really, really go out of their way, put an enormous amount of effort into it. Dan comes from a very extensive background of entrepreneurship. He's been building businesses for a long time. He understands what it takes to make a farm and ranch work. He also is very, very well versed in recreation, outfitting, things like that. So if there's anybody on the call needs some assistance or consultations or support with hunting, large outfitting, things like that, and you're in Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, any of those areas, Dan Murphy is definitely your guy. So he does not just a real estate agent. He really is one of those guys that's a land professional, which is why he's got to the point where he is now. He's the National Vice President of the Real Estate Land Institute, which is the premier land brokerage institute in the United States. They do phenomenal things. Dan's going to be an upcoming national president here very soon. And I was going to go through a bunch of the awards that Dan has won buying and selling property, but there's too much of them. So you guys really do have an expert here. I'm not an expert with water. I'm going to be tossing some questions to Dan to try to get some information in my head. You have questions, email those in, please, and we'll try to get those put out in front of Dan and see what his opinion is. But Dan, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you, man.
It's nice to see you too, Craig. That's pretty humbling. I'm not after that introduction. It's I really hope I don't screw this up.
Well, humility is a really good thing. It's kind of humility is changing in Colorado very quickly, it seems. But anyway, well, whole different topic. Maybe we'll talk about CU Buffs on another week.
Yeah, you can't beat that. That has been exciting, and I'm not a Buffs fan, and it's still been exciting. So
it's interesting to see what they're doing there. But yeah, anyway, Dan, here we are, man. We're talking about water, right? Talking about water rights, and a lot of folks are probably calling in here. Some landowners, some brokerages. For the folks out there that want to just get their heads wrapped around what is a water right? What are you talking about with water rights? Surface water rights flowing through canals and rivers versus subsurface water rights. Give us a general understanding of what you think about when you hear the word water rights. What are you talking about?
So the first thing that always comes to mind for me personally is I compare water rights to grabbing Jello. And it's because it's such a moving target. And when I say that, it really is dependent on specific drainages, specific waterways, who's putting water into what drainages. You know, if you look at Colorado in general, we really have 5 major rivers that lead Colorado. Well, we over negotiated water we don't have at the turn of the century. And so we've been playing catch up ever since. We haven't had flow rates like that since the day we negotiated. And so when you look at what's happening downriver, the water values are so different in every different drainage. It's because of who can use what where. And so there is no general rule that pays attention to any water rights, you know, and it doesn't matter if it's, you know, the Western states predominantly deal in what we call prior appropriation. So basically it's a first come, first served basis. And so when we start looking through water rights, you know, seniority of those water rights, how they pertain to the land, how the uses have been done historically, what have been what they call consumptive rates. There's so many different factors that play into that it sounds terrible, and I'm supposed to be the professional in this. And my first advice is we need to hire a water attorney and we need to hire a water engineer. And without question, those two things are absolutely imperative when it comes to understanding, number one, what somebody may be selling, number two, what somebody may be buying. And so our point of view is really kind of from a 30,000 foot level. We first try to determine what water rights do we have on paper. Where do they fit to this particular property or this particular drainage or this particular state? You know, how do these water rights play out? And then the next thing we try to do is acquire what's real on the ground. So you might own them on paper, but what's wet? And so in doing that, we'll typically bring in a water engineer that is basically, a water engineer is a fancy way of saying you're going to get with the water boss, who is the district, who runs the district deliveries on waters or whatever sub-district you're in, or depending on, once again, what state, what county, what region, what drainage. But you try to determine, you know, who gets water when, what are the calls on that water, and what are the deliverables. And so trying to understand what water actually gets put on the property for what amount of time, for what consumptive use, that gives you the where you're going in the future. And so every drainage, I'm going to say this 1,000 times, but every drainage really dictates where that water's going to. So for example, the Colorado River delivering water downstream, we really have very little storage once we leave the 3 reservoirs coming out of Blue Mesa. So at Blue Mesa, and then it gets into Silver, and then it moves down from there. And then we leave the state and go into Lake Powell. Well, unfortunately, the Colorado River side, we really don't get credit for good years. We only get penalized for bad. And so our debt load on water is never ending, unfortunately, because we don't have the opportunity to store our excess water and get credit for it on a good heavy year like we had last year. We had great deliverables last year. I think Lake Powell came up 88 feet. But in that, Lake Colorado doesn't get any credit. We're still working off our debt from bad years. And so that's something that's currently in the legislation, but that's a pretty good example of what we're working towards, where we have problems. And that happens in all the major drainages leaving the state, whether it be coming out of New Mexico and the Rio Grande, whether it be working with the San Juan. We have all kinds of different issues with every one of those drainages. You know, the Upper Rio is probably the most critical when it comes to agricultural uses. And of course, all the Platte is the most critical when it comes to consumptive uses. And so very, very different. I don't know if that helps or if that's a good start into your questions, but the overall perception on water is understand where you're at, understand what you have, understand what you've delivered in the past, and then understand what the uses are for those deliverable waters. Then we start breaking down, okay, where are we? How do we, you know, who has control? Who does what?
Okay. There's probably some folks on the call that might have questions of, you know, maybe they own water rights, maybe they don't. They have a certificate that says they do own shares or something that has to do with water. If someone's looking at water rights similarly like they would look at mineral rights, where this is something they can go look up on their property, are they thinking of it correctly? Or is water rights stored in a completely different book? How would somebody go about finding, do they have something adjudicated on their property? Do they own rights somewhere else? How would they even find out if they own the water rights in the first place, Dan?
Well, in Colorado, you go to Colorado Water Board and can pull up what water rights are where. pertaining to your property and getting an idea. Your title work is also going to have a general idea of what water rights are decreed to you. So that would be the very high level start from there. The next thing I would do is personally, from a rancher standpoint, I would find out the district, the sub-district you're in, and who's your water boss. I would go to my water boss. Honestly, those guys typically, now that's, once again, you hit on a little earlier, things are changing in the West. Used to, our water bosses were retired ranchers that knew every drainage and every turnout and every deliverable of that valley and who had seniority and who didn't. That day's kind of changing. We're getting people now that don't have quite the experience that are water bosses, and they're, you know, a lot of times they're playing catch up when you go to them to ask for specifics on those water rights. I would still search out who's what we call the ditch rider. You know, that guy has more knowledge of what's on any property. Of that guy or gal has more knowledge of what's on your property than probably anybody else. And the other part of that is he's going to have a super idea about when that water was delivered and who calls what. That's the cheapest way you can get into finding out kind of what you have. You know, you're not ordering title work. You're not, you know, go to the courthouse. You can have an idea what's there. You talk to the Colorado Water Board. That's all online. You can look that data up to find out who's got what where. But the real meat and potatoes, go find out who your ditch rider is and go say hello. That's going to give you more knowledge about what, even if you're a smaller parcel that's a shared ditch right, that, you know, may have a rotation of days that come through a specific ditch that are delivered on a specific time frame. He or she is going to have a very good idea about, because those are pissing contests. In all honesty, that's when you really start getting into arguments, is when it gets down to that level. And there's a lot more of that today than there was 10 years ago. And there'll be a lot more of it in the next 10 years than there is today. And so understanding that dynamic is a good way to understand what are your rights that you have on the property. Then you start getting into things you mentioned, consumptive use or evaporative losses, or, you know, anytime there's a pond built on a lake, do you have a storage right? And that's probably one of the bigger factors that's so different for the Mountain West, is we account for every drop of water. Whereas in other parts of the country, they're trying to get rid of it. You know, they're putting in, of course, the waters of the United States is a whole nother subject. The new WOTUS ruling. We'll hopefully talk a little bit about that as well, and the impacts that might have.
Go ahead and touch on that, Dan. I'm not familiar with it. Tell us about that, the WOTUS ruling, what that does, and not just impacting Colorado folks, but someone who might be sitting in Wyoming listening to this, and someone who might be down in Mississippi listening to this. How does this impact everybody across the United States when it comes to water? And then also, if you could lead into, how does that change? What you just talked about is very Colorado specific, but how does that change for somebody sitting in Utah or Arizona or California? And go ahead and touch on that too, but go ahead and start with the ruling and then go ahead and carry that one down the field.
So the waters of the United States is actually, in my mind, an atrocity. It's absolutely terrifying what we have going on right now in our federal government. And the problem isn't so much that we've got that they came in and put in new rules. The problem is there's so much ambiguity in how you fight those rules, how you get challenged. And so the idea behind this is, in my mind, this is my opinion, and I'll put my caveat in front of this right now. You know, as the incoming president of National RLI, we are working really hard to challenge waters of the United States, signed into law in January or December of last year. It was kind of a 11th hour deal. This thing had tried to be presented by Obama. We got it shut down, and I've been on multiple water boards. We got it shut down through legislative acts and personally lawsuits. And then Biden picked this up at the 11th hour, and he signed it into law in December of, I guess it would be 2022. He did that before the change in the House and Senate came around, where he was going to lose it again. So now it's been challenged. It will go to the Supreme Court. I believe as of this week, 27 states have ruled against it, and they are not implementing the Waters of the United States Act. Colorado is not one of those. Wyoming has stepped in. I believe Utah has as well. Texas has. But when it comes to control, that's the big unknown right now, and why people are fighting that, why we're fighting it all the way to the Supreme Court. is one of the major caveats in this deal is anything that puddles during a rainstorm is now considered properties of the United States. So if you run an irrigation ditch, if you try to make manipulations to a ditch, you're now under the waters of the United States. So everything that transfers or holds water is now jurisdiction of the federal government. And so it's a very, very scary scenario when it comes to the challenges that it boils down to the attitudes in different districts, how far they can or can't take a challenge. The problem is there's not clear rules on how you challenge them or how you go through and try to define the definitions of what they're asking. So they've gotten themselves in a position, in my opinion, to where they have all the power, and it's very, very hard for the common rancher or the municipalities or wetland delineation teams or restoration projects or hydro projects of any kind. It's very challenging for you to have a clear set of rules that you can come in and define what may or may not be under their control. And so that's where the biggest parts of that has come around.
So what you're saying is, and let me know if I'm summarizing this correctly. So let's say I'm standing in Park City, Utah right now, and I've got a 200-acre ranch out there, and I have a drainage, and I've got a little barrier built there that collects water when it rains. You're saying now that anything that puddles, anything that would collect water, and maybe it's been there since 1950, I don't know, but it was there when I bought the property. Now you're saying that according to this ruling, that would be federally controlled or regulated. Is that right?
Right. It would be considered as tributaries to waters of the United States. And so it's a huge, huge, huge land grab, in my opinion, and a ton of control. And so, and even in some of the eastern states, somewhere we're working on is there's new regulations as far as testing goes for guys that are putting in tiling, and they're delivering water out of wetter meadows back into drainages. There's all kinds of testing in that now that we've never seen before when it comes to pesticides or any kind of fertilizers and things that there's no question you've got a chance of some of that coming off your field and going into some of those waterways. So the rules may or may not be good. The rules may or may not have benefits. I don't know them well enough to argue that. What I do understand is the concept of them having more power in a position where they've already screwed up so much, in my opinion. It terrifies me. And as we look at younger and younger people coming out of a master's program in Maine, excuse me, and they've never been out west, all of a sudden now they're coming out to water situations. And we're seeing it in the BLM, we're seeing it in the Forest Service, we're seeing it in the game and fish departments, where we've got people have zero experience, have gotten a master's degree in whatever degree they need to have in order to get that job. And now all of a sudden they're the leaders of these issues in the West. You're seeing it in minerals. We're seeing it across the board. And there is very little common sense left in a lot of this. It's, well, the rules state this, and then the rules are not clearly defined. So the recipe for disaster here is pretty monumental. That's why you've seen such a legislative push to stop this. On top of you've seen an opportunity for so many states to file suit against it, have already filed suit against it. ROI has filed an amicus brief along with the National Association of Realtors against this. We have lobbyists in Washington working right now to try to get control of where are we really going with this. And so, like river restoration projects, habitat enhancement, we're running into the districts are really what define that. The rules don't make any sense. So you have district leaders that are whatever EPA section that's in, whatever waters of the United States office you're in, wherever you're at, those guys sometimes they have common sense and sometimes they don't.
That what you're saying there makes a lot of sense. And I think it touches on a much larger point that folks, I think every individual takes advantage of it living in the United States of America, such an amazing country that it is private. And what we're talking about with water rights, it's private individuals owning the right to that water, right? And that's what Landgate does, is deal with private ownership of mineral rights or private revenue generation from a solar farm or wind farm. It's extraordinarily unique in human history. much less the current countries that are across the planet, that us as individual citizens get to own the rights to that property, right? And I think you touched on a really valid point that, it might be a topic for later on, is what some of the current legislation actions are doing for private ownership of land, of mineral rights, of water rights. I think this is your testimony there is pretty evident that, it's very difficult, and it's again very rare for folks like us, American citizens, that we get to own those rights. And I think it's important for everybody on the call, left, right, center.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It's about private ownership, and that's kind of what we try to. That's the platform we've made at Landgate, right? Is letting folks see what they have for that ownership, what the value is, and then transacting. So we'll shift gears a little bit here, Dan. That's a very concerning thing. I'm really glad you brought that up, folks that are listening. If this is, if you own water rights, if you have a ranch, you have a farm, sounds to me like this is going to impact you significantly. And then at the same time, if someone's on the phone and a phone call or in this webinar, thinking, boy, I sure would like to buy a piece of property and I'd like to have the water rights on it. Well, that also impacts what you're getting ready to buy. So what have you seen, Dan, like over the last, in a couple different ways, in the need for the commodity of water, what have you seen change over the next 10 years? And how do kind of what's the forecast of that? What do you anticipate as far as water? Are you going to be able to buy a ranch with water rights on it anymore? Or is everything going to be stripped away? Is it going to be sold to a large city? Is it going to be sold to Las Vegas? Where's it going to go? And how's that impacting your current real estate transactions now? Everything you said before, and then what you kind of been seeing and what the forecast is going to do. How's that impact your business every day?
Well, I mean, it monumentally would be the single term that best describes how important water is to these properties. Once again, a lot of that boils back to the district or sub-district or drainage you're in, or who has downstream use of that water. And for example, the Colorado River Basin is relatively protected. Those water rights are typically tied to the properties in most ways. So in order to transfer water downstream to deliver it to Arizona or to a downstream user in Vegas, whatever we've got going on in those scenarios, you have to have the opportunity to store that right. And that's where so much of the Colorado side has been protected. Whereas if you get into the Platte, anything servicing the Eastern Slope, for example, Colorado is probably the closest one because I know it the best. But going into municipalities, we start looking at water right transfers for buy and dry, and significantly different than what we'll see on the Colorado side. And of course, Colorado's affecting all 5 Western states, and so that negotiation is an interesting dynamic. And then when you start looking at the stuff leaving on the Platte, like I said, everything's over appropriated, but they have different uses. So the buy and dry side on the eastern slope of the United States is very, very financially. We've seen water rights transferring as high as, well, we had some under contract just recently at about $170,000 an acre foot. Those are giant numbers. Wow. We did not close.
So before you move on, describe what an acre foot is, just so the people.
So an acre foot is basically, is basically 1 acre a foot deep in water. That's how much an acre foot is. And so it's a calculation of gallons per acre foot. And so, when you start thinking about an acre foot, you think that's a lot of water. It's really not a lot of water. And so we recently had a deal on conservation easements, and we were over near Walsenburg on that particular deal. And we were trying to buy adjudicated water that the city of Walsenburg had taken off of ranches. We were trying to buy some of that back in order to increase our conservation value on that property. And so our contracted price was ridiculous. I think some of the, you'll see acre value anywhere from, I've seen it probably as low as 12,000 an acre foot all the way into that 150 plus. So you're talking about huge values on some of these ranches, and then other ranches, it's not quite as imperative.
So that big number you had is 170, and right. If you convert that into gallons, there's roughly 325,000 gallons in a acre foot. That's 50 cents a gallon of water.
Right. But now
right?
remember, you're buying that in perpetuity, so you get to
Okay.
reuse that
Okay.
water. So that's not a one-time purchase fee for 1 acre foot that
So
year.
just
So
describe that, Dan. What that means. So
so
if I bought that, I spent $170,000 and I bought 1 acre foot. What does that mean for what did I actually buy and what can I do with it?
So a lot of that depends on what back again to that the original concept we started with is your
Mhm.
deliverables. When
Okay.
do you get it and how long do you get it for and what has it been used for in the past? So and that's called consumptive use. And so when you look at agricultural consumptive use, the highest consumptive use that we have on the table is alfalfa fields. Alfalfa fields has more use and basically it's how much does it drink and how much evaporates off the plant. And so that consumptive use is probably the most value. When I go into a field and look at a ranch, or when I look at a ranch and go into a field, if it's alfalfa, I want to know how many years has that been planted and what have they delivered year to year. That's going to end up being my real number in value. So you may have a higher water right, but if you can't show consumptive use, then you don't have a deliverable to somebody else downstream. Does that make sense? So
I,
if
I
if
think so.
something's going yeah, if something's going to go into one of these drainages where eventually the city of whatever is going to buy that right, they're going to use it for people. And so that's the highest use on water is consumptive use for people. And then it's the agriculture falls in below that. And so what I would want to do is if I was trying to transfer a water right, I would want to know how long has that water been used in what was its consumptive use? How many acres were under production in alfalfa? How many months do they deliver water to that? How many cuttings do they get, et cetera? And so that's going to give me a calculated number that's now my transferable right downstream. And so you can't do that in every drainage. You can't do it in every basin. You can't do that on every stream, but in the ones that it's key locations, that's what you're transferring downriver. So we've seen transfers of guys. I'll give you another example: $18 million ranch, spectacular place on the Upper Rio Grande. It had lakes that had been built on that ranch since 1896. Those lakes were not adjudicated, so they did not have a storage right on water that had been stored since 1896. We had to go back and buy Trans Mountain water. I mean, guys, when I talk about grabbing Jello, this is the perfect example of grabbing Jello. There had been water off the top of the Continental Divide that had been diverted into a different drainage. That's called Trans Mountain water. And so when water is moved from one drainage to another, there's no downstream impact with that water. In other words, people can't claim that they had been using that water historically because it had returned into the system X number of times. Therefore, that water was spoken for, even though it wasn't a senior water right, that water was spoken for downriver from other uses. Trans Mountain water is the highest value of water in anywhere because it has no downstream implications. So there's several of them in the state. When you get into just in Colorado, they're all over the Mountain West when it comes to municipalities. But that being said, we had to go buy Trans Mountain water to try to secure a lake that was on a ranch that was built in 1896. You would think those things would be grandfathered in. They're
Mhm.
not. And so that we're starting to see more and more of that throughout the Mountain West where people think they have a water right because they've had water stored on their property since their grandparents remembered it, but that doesn't necessarily make that true. So once again, back to the start at the bottom, find out what are your deliverables, what rights do you have on that property and how often do you get the water for those rights?
It's interesting. So I grew up in Colorado as well. So I somewhat understand some of the things you're saying, but then I started doing some deals and we expanded into Wyoming and the Dakotas and Montana and Utah and all, basically we're across the United States now. What and this is what I learned, and I still don't have my head wrapped around it, Dan, is what we determine what we call a water right standing in the state of Colorado could be something completely different when I'm standing in the state of Wyoming or Utah or Montana or California. And then you made an earlier point. Some of the stuff we're talking about here, it's critically important in the Mountain West or the Great Plains area.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas somebody in Kentucky, that's a problem for them. They've got too much darn water
Yeah.
there, right? So, what is so on this side of the Mississippi, in the western portion of the Mississippi River, how big of an impact do you see tied to ranches and real estate is the importance of, okay, well, you see this ranch, it's being marketed. it comes with water rights. How big of an impact does that just tagline comes with water rights impact what state you're in? And where do you want that tag of where do you want, what state do you really want water rights in, and where does it's not that significant, if that's even a relative question.
Yeah, there isn't anywhere where it's not significant. The out of all the West, Colorado has kind of led the charge on defining what's what with water. And the other states have a tendency of following Colorado when it comes to any kind of legislative act or any kind of preservation concerns. Same with conservation easements. Colorado's kind of led the world in conservation easements the same way. And both of those, I guess you could say that makes sense. Where we're one of the highest elevations, this is where it starts. And so everything flows downhill from here. It's almost the same with legislation when it comes to those specifics. But that means pretty much all the Mountain West is under the same concept of prior appropriation. And so all those water rights, the people who got here first have the first right. And that's where a lot of people don't realize how powerful California really is. California has what we call the Big Seven. Those 7 counties really, they have the oldest water right in the West. And so when you really get down to it, those guys control, think about how big that is. That's going all the way up through the upper ends. I mean, the lower edges of Idaho, coming into all of Utah, parts of Nevada, all of Arizona, all of Colorado, the whole western side of Wyoming. All that's going into that one specific set of negotiations is really driven by those 7 old counties. And so the Big Seven that they're referred to, they really have a huge voice when it comes to us trying to negotiate deliverables to Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And so when we get into these arguments, those guys, they have the oldest right, period. And so everybody else falls in behind them. And that's where that first come, first serve, prior appropriation mentality drives the ship. Now, as you go east of the divide, that changes significantly, but their uses are still the same, especially until you get into the heavy flow areas, which we're not. I mean, the western side of the United States really doesn't see much of that. So if it's even, eastern Wyoming, southern Montana, eastern Wyoming, going into Idaho, North Carolina, North Dakota, South Dakota, coming in that whole bank all the way down, even Kansas, going into parts of Oklahoma, Texas, our deliverables to New Mexico are huge. And so if you really look at how all that flows off of the western part of the United States, 100% different animal than what they see on the eastern side. Of course, there's been all kinds of talk about pumping up to the high Mountain West to deliver waters, coming out of the Missouri. There's all kinds of ideas, and then you get into all the different implications that go with that. Most of them are environmental. And that, not only is it a pipeline system across private land, which is monumental to begin with, but then there's deliverables of different assets that we don't want to be transferring. So purification is a big issue. What would we be delivering that thrive in their country, but would be detrimental? Things such as the zebra mussel, things that they've gotten into the lower waterways and they're trying to keep them out of the upper waterways. So lots of different things that are happening there. And once again, when I talk about water rights being very similar to grabbing Jello, you're starting to get an idea. I mean, if you just look at the sub-districts of the San Luis Valley, we're drying up 80,000 acres of production ground in the San Luis Valley, mainly because we came out of World War II and we put a ton of what we call deep straws into that aquifer, and those water rights were not adjudicated. They into the war, we're coming in, we've got a big agricultural push in the United States, fantastic ground. They call it the Holy Grail when it comes to production in the upper end of that valley. We put down straws, we put pivots throughout a tremendous amount of acreage through that entire drainage all the way into northern New Mexico. And in that whole section, now they're coming back and, okay, the aquifer's depleted. If you don't have senior water rights, you can't pump anymore. They form sub-districts. Those sub-districts are buying water from other districts to put back into the Rio Grande drainage. It's a huge dynamic. And there's real water right value in the San Luis Valley. There's real water right on the Platte. There's real water right in multiple places across the West. But some of them have it, some of them don't. So you're back into the same world. And then the question is, what can you legally, if you own it, Can you transfer it? Can you sell it to somebody else downstream? Who's your end buyer? Where are you going to get the real value out of that? What we've seen lately happening through the Mountain West is a lot of conservation districts buying on some of our larger ranches, coming in and buying water rights off those ranches to keep them within the drainage. So they're back to that buy and dry. We had a ranch recently that sold for $2 million. They came back and offered us $3 million just for the water, not the river frontage, not the land, just the water rights. And that happened recently on another piece. We have it listed at 11,970,000 on 1,584 acres, and the conservation district threw an offer at us at $4 million just for the acre foot of water we had on that ranch. Unfortunately, if you take it off, now what do you end up with? And so you have to really balance where those dollar values really pay off in the long run, but there's real value in it.
So for the landowners sitting here listening to this call, they may be thinking, either one, how can I buy water rights? Number one, like how can I go and how can I just go buy them? But maybe there's a lot of there's a ton of folks in the rural part of the country that they live off of a water well, right? And they automatically assume that they have water rights because they have a water well they're producing out of an aquifer. You kept using the word adjudication. Explain to the folks listening, what does it mean to have adjudicated water rights, which are typically probably going to be in the subsurface, right? And what does that exactly mean? What can that individual do with that adjudicated water right with their water well? What are their limitations? A lot of folks, they'll call us, Dan, and the reason I'm asking, they'll call us and say, well, I've got it written here in my deed. I have water rights. I have adjudicated water rights for this residential water well. And in their mind, they think they can sell that water right. And it gets back to, I think, what you were saying. Well, what is your allocated usage in that right? What can you do with it? So can you touch a little bit on that? And like, what do you typically hear from folks that are on, not the enormous ranches, Dan, like the 40 to 100 acre lot where there's a house there, they have a well. How does what you're talking about affect those types of folks?
Well, and domestic wells are very, very different than any kind of a production well. And so typically what you'll find on a domestic well is you have an allotment of up to 15 gallons a minute by law. And then anything over 15 gallons a minute, you're not allowed to pump. And so basically a domestic well will give you the right to typically irrigate 1 acre of lawn in that well. And so having value for a transferable asset on a domestic well, to my mind, is non-existent. I don't know of any value that comes from that. I do know there's protections to have a well on a per 35 acre parcel when it comes to residential. And so there's the opportunity to drill. Doesn't mean you're going to automatically find water, but it does mean that there's tools in place that protect the right to try to find water. And so that part has been in place from a domestic use. As far as defining what what is your pump rate, what is your allowable use of that water, that's clearly going to be in your water right. It's going to give you a flow rate. For example, we have another ranch listed right now, spectacular property. It's got 2 spring wells. And so that's a designated well, but it's a ground spring. And so if you're bringing groundwater up, if you're exposing groundwater in the West, you need to have a well permit to expose and use that well water, that spring water, over and above a filed adjudicated spring. Adjudicated spring means you have the right to that water on your place. Typically that water starts and ends on that property. So you might have a spring that's producing 2 gallons a minute or 3 gallons a minute. Some of them I've seen as high as 50 gallons a minute. Well, actually 72, I think, is the highest one I've ever seen. So there's one that Mirror Ranch Group has listed right now that's almost 500 gallons a minute, and it's in the Saguache Valley. Absolutely phenomenal artesian well. You open it up and it just pukes water. Those things don't happen very often, but that's got real value. The big one like that, well, that's real value. Now
when you say real value, that's an enormous well, 500 gallons a minute, and you don't even got a pump on it, which means when Dan's saying artesian well, that means there's hydraulic head that's going to push the water up to what's called a piezometric surface, and it's going to flow naturally. What is a 500 gallon per minute well? What's the value of something like that? Just so people wrap their heads around something like that.
On that one in particular, because it's in the Gunnison drainage, which is in the Colorado drainage, you don't have storage to store that water make it a marketable asset that you can then turn and deliver downstream. So if it doesn't have a real value for uses on the land, there isn't currently, there is not a downstream opportunity. Now there's some legislation in place that could be a major change on the Colorado side of things, which we would be closer to the Platte, because there would be some deliverable benefits to downstream Arizona, Nevada, California. There would be some deliverable assets coming, and that's, you know, and I'll stay on that one. So that 500 gallon a minute spring, absolutely incredible. Runs year round. The Gunnison Valley is incredibly cold. In the winter months, it still flows like it does in the summer months. It's stunning. And that one is a developable fishery. So from that particular deal, the benefits are agricultural uses for irrigated meadows, sub-irrigated meadows, and the recreational benefits on that are pretty phenomenal. What you can do with a fishery, you know, that water's coming out not warm, but it's not cold either. And so that water could deliver some production opportunities with some fisheries as well. And that we've had several people look at it over the years for the tilapia opportunities with that particular deal, but the infrastructure costs would be high. But that kind of water, how do you ever replace 500 gallons a minute artesian? You know, something that's puking water on its own. Those are great finds. This particular drainage, you can't take advantage of a downstream user because of the implications on the Colorado River District. If that same water was in the San Luis Valley, or if that same water was on the Platte, can you imagine what that value would be? You know, you'd be talking probably $40,000 to $50,000 an acre foot on producing 500 gallons a minute. So do that calculation, and it would be and you would never want to sell a water right like that. You'd want to lease that water right. And so, you know, you talk about that with minerals all the time. It's the same thing. You would want to stay a part of that usage down the road so that your family and your generations to come have gain in those assets as the time passes.
Dan, you bring up a really good point there. And we're getting close to the top of the hour. If you guys have questions, again, for Dan to answer, this is a really good time to send them in to Michaela Bishop at mb@landgate.com. We'll get your questions answered. But the difference between leasing and selling, a lot of the folks that call Landgate and ask questions about water rights, they feel like the only thing they can do is sell their water rights. And most of them don't want to. And from the what you're kind of saying here, the spirit of what you're saying is, you know, it might be something you want to hold on to because they're very difficult to find and to get. But you mentioned leasing water rights. How would someone go about, what's the difference? And again, we've really focused on Colorado. Is leasing water rights something someone can do in Nebraska or Kansas or Wyoming or outside of Colorado? Is that something that is a needle mover for some of these large farmers and ranchers outside of, you know, in the Mountain West and maybe even closer to the Mississippi River? Leasing out minerals, is that a market that these people can participate in?
You know, yes. I mean, yes, I think you can. It once again, it boils down to, you know, where can your water be transferred to? Who's your user? And then those guys are the leasee is going to dictate, or the municipality in most of these cases is going to dictate control of that. And so you have to ask yourself, do I want a piece of something instead of one piece of something smaller? And you know, get yourself in a position where you can stay a player in that. You maintain the ground, especially what we're seeing now is a lot of guys, they may do a long-term lease agreement with the municipality down the road, and they don't have use for it right now. So you're getting money out of that asset today, and you have use of that asset until they call that asset to be used in another format. And so they want to make sure that the consumptive use is maintained on that water. So they're going to want you as the farmer growing alfalfa, row crops, whatever you're doing, to maintain the use of that. So the day down the road when it's needed for human consumptive use, they've got a water right they already own. So they're forecasting into the future as well. A lot of times there's some pretty good advantages to be taken advantage of, where you can basically sell your water right or sell your land and have use of it back, or stay involved in the use of that water as part of a manager or part of a leaseholder, whatever you're doing to get bits and pieces. And I got to tell you, that's well beyond my pay grade as far as, you know, how you negotiate those, what you put together. We've got access to fantastic attorneys that are great in this field, And so, in our business, you become the source of the source. You have intimate knowledge of little, you have great knowledge of who knows more. And so
Sure.
that, from our standpoint as a company, that's our mantra, is we're the source of the source. And so that being said, we try to surround ourselves with professionals that are really good at this. And then you end up learning enough to be really dangerous. In this case, I'm the really dangerous guy.
Yeah, well, I would say that, I mean, there's plenty to be said about not being the expert of a single subject and being very well knowledge, like be well rounded about everything. And I think that speaks very highly of M4 Ranches. I mean, whatever anything that has to do with ranching, farming, it's stuff you guys know it. You guys have, either you or Seth or Jake or somebody in your group really can expose, again, some expertise on that. And again, that's why we really wanted you to come in here. One of the things that I get asked from small landowners, Dan, all the way up to enormous financial investors, is who buys and who leases water rights?
That once again, that ties back into specifics on who has the benefit downstream and what can you deliver downstream. I mean, there's a significant group of guys that have stepped in and bought a lot of ground very quietly on property at the edge of Colorado on the Colorado River. So the last water users on the Colorado River. And I'm not exactly sure what their game plan is, but they're not buying this for giggles. They're buying it
Sure.
because they see things changing on the dynamics of deliverable waters downstream. And they're not planning on delivering it to the deserts of Utah. They're planning on delivering it to the municipalities downstream outside of Colorado. And so there's stuff in the works that is going to make those kind of things valuable. And there's people that's all they do is pay attention to water, and they're trying to play ahead of the curve. But a lot of this stuff has to go back to huge changes within the legislative system. And I'm talking of the feds, not state, not state stuff. At this point, that water's being negotiated federally. And so big deals out there. Colorado is, a perfect example. Even Eastern Wyoming is already seeing it. You're starting to see some of those waters delivered to some of these bigger cities. And of course,
Right.
you start looking at Albuquerque, you start looking at Denver, you start looking at Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, the dynamics that have come out of that, the water two states right there in specific, Colorado and Wyoming, are delivering a ton of that water downstream. And they have figured out ways to get value into that water because you have municipalities as your end user. That's where the real money has been in the past. As far as the agricultural side, buying acre feet of water in places like the San Luis Valley with all the deep straws that were drilled, people want to keep producing, and they've got excellent fields. They don't have the water right to keep those pivots running. So they're working at ways to buy senior water rights that are deliverables on the Rio Grande in order to give them the right to continue to pump water out of the ground. And so those types of transferables are a big deal. But back to the same thing, who is your end user in where you're at? Where are you supplying water, and who has benefit of that water downstream? That's your buyer, if that's what you're looking for.
Very useful, Dan. That's very good. And that does make complete sense, is what, essentially, in a nutshell, right? What's the water being currently used for? And that's essentially what you could likely transfer it down to. I grew up on the other side of the state in the Platte River Valley, South Platte River Valley, and my wife's family is from Western Nebraska. And it's interesting, we're talking about water rights. There's a very large proposal to build a new reservoir just south of Lake McConaughey. That's my wife's entire legacy. That's my wife's entire family is taking up this new reservoir. So, that's kind of what we talked about earlier. What's the trajectory that you feel, for the folks listening here on the call? We're about to the top of the hour here. For the folks that have mineral rights in their hands, what is your suggestion to them? Not even just in Colorado, but really the kind of the Mountain West, because water rights aren't super critical where it rains because they got plenty of water. But what kind of vision do you have for them? Should they buy, sell? Should they hold? I mean, this is what you do. You do these transactions for a living. You see them every day. What's in your crystal ball, and what kind of recommendations can you give to the folks on the call?
Simply put, the most important thing you can do on any ranch is make sure you're using every water right you have. So prove use on everything. If you have something that is, if you have springs that are not decreed, you really want to talk. Some people believe it's a wise idea to get every spring decreed. Some people believe it's not a good idea to get authorities involved in your ground on any kind of water right that's not decreed. I've seen way more positives on getting water rights that are either, if you have undecreed wells or springs, getting those decreed. If you have deliverables on your water right, whether those be ditch rights or it be flow rights, cubic feet per second, make sure you have your tools in place. Make sure your head gates are strong. Make sure your flumes are identifying what water you have. Make sure you're delivering what water right you own. Don't let them go by or let them get away from you, because they will move on to somebody else. If you don't use them, you'll lose them. So that's number one. Especially if you're a generational ranch owner that you're taking over from somebody else and you're not quite familiar with what the family's done in the past, learn what they've done in the past, get that water use on the ground and get it protected. That's number one. The balance of the other part of it is then understand what you own. So as a new owner or even an old owner, it's not a bad idea to go back and reflect on your water rights. You might be surprised at what you find. And so, do a water search, get with a water attorney, get with a title company, identify what's on your property. And then if you have questions, talk to a water engineer, talk to your water boss, make sure that you're getting that water on the ground to get it protected. And then as far as value goes, learning what's going on in your area, your sub-district, your drainage, your river basin, understanding, what values are being delivered where, helps you to better understand what you're trying to either market or you own. And so whether you're selling it or not is irrelevant, but knowing what you own is the biggest benefit to that. Now you're not caught by surprise, or people don't take advantage of it. So, find out the incidentals, be organized on your water, protect your deliverables, make sure your uses are in place, and understand who your downstream people are that might be coming knocking on your door at some point, whether it be in estate planning or it's in a future sale. Those are the important things to pay attention to.
That's really good, Dan. I think those 2 or 3 points you just threw out there is something for everybody. Hopefully it's worthwhile. You guys, we're about 55 minutes in. Dan, thank you so much for spending time with us. And for those of you listening, this is what Dan does for a living. He looks at pieces of property, he buys them, he sells them. And this is not just his only expertise. The M4 ranches, I mean, if there's anything you need to know about elk hunting, deer hunting, anything recreational in the western portion of the United States, these are your guys to talk to. Some absolutely phenomenal properties they have for sale. And someday, Dan, I hope to buy one of those properties that you're marketing. But man, thank you so much. Michaela and Jordan, if you could put Dan's contact information in the chat there, just so folks, if they want to reach out to you and Seth and Jake, some of the guys there. These are land professionals. I don't call these guys brokers. They're not real estate agents. These guys are land professionals, and they know land very, very well. So thank you all for your time. Dan, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure having you on, man. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. It's been an honor. I really appreciate the invitation. It's quite humbling. Thank you.
Very good. All right. Thanks, everyone. You guys have a good rest of your day.